Chapter 2. A Cruel and Intolerable Burden, Black Mississippians and Freedom of Choice. On a hot August day in 1964, Adams left her home in Fanine, headed for a meeting in Philadelphia, Mississippi, located in Neshoba County. The plan was that she and other passengers in her car would follow Jay LaHaye, a white civil rights organizer for California, who was also carrying a group of people to the meeting. It was a dangerous trip for a group of civil rights leaders to make in the summer of 1964. Days earlier, the murdered bodies of civil rights workers Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney were found buried in a dam on the outskirts of Neshoba County. As Eileen neared Philadelphia, she lost sight of Jay's vehicle and her car began sputtering. She explains what happened next. I kept circling and circling, and each time I would circle, there was a service station, and some whites started coming out, with axe handles and shovels and whatever else they had. I couldn't find my way, but I saw a black guy. He was fixing a tire, but he was afraid to stand up and talk to me to try to tell me where I was trying to get to. So he just kept fixing his tire, and out the corner of my eyes, I could see those white men advancing on us to the car where we were. And he said to me, "Get in the car and go now." That's how he said it, now. But he kept on working on his tire and acting like he didn't see us. So when he said that, it was cold steel. He didn't have to shout. I knew what he said and what he meant. That it's getting dangerous and he didn't want anything to happen to us, so he was trying to help us. So I got back in my car and started again. By that time, Jay had missed us, and he came back to try and pick us up. And then we followed him on out and went across the railroad track and went to the meeting. And to this day, I don't know what they did at that meeting. It was such a horrible kind of whatever. But we were glad to be alive because we really thought we were going to get buried in that dam that day also. Eileen and her husband John would go on to lead the fight for school desegregation in Rankin County several years later. Their 4 children would be some of the first black students to attend an all-white school where under FOC and the desegregation lawsuit brought against the Rankin County in 1973 bears their son Kenneth's name. Pioneers yet quite ordinary individuals, Eileen and John Adams were but 2 of hundreds of black parents and students who, at the great personal cost, led the fight in their own backyards to force their school districts to comply with desegregation through a plan called Freedom of Choice. For Eileen, it was a choice that began years earlier when she faced her deepest fears on that road to Philadelphia. Everybody has their Philadelphia. It's a moment when you face your greatest fear, knowing that you may not survive. But you do survive, and when you come out the other side, you find that your Philadelphia has stripped away your fear. You know for certain that you can survive fear and that you're stronger than you ever knew you would be. As reflected in the stories told in this chapter, being the first in their communities to send their children to formerly all-white schools or being the first black student to attend such a school was a fearful experience. Certainly many suffered greatly for their freedom of choice. Their commitment to persevere in the face of their own Philadelphia is testimony to their courage, strength, and fortitude. Getting a piece of the pie, being the first under freedom of choice. May Bertha and Matthew Carter were poor sharecroppers who farmed 25 acres of land in Sunflower County on the Pamble Plantation. Sunflower County was the home of Senator James Eastland, a staunch and vocal opponent to school desegregation, and civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer. It was also the birthplace of White Citizens Council, formed in 1954 in Indianola for the purpose of preserving segregated schools. May, Bertha, and Matthew were as active as poor blacks living in the Delta could be in the growing civil rights movement. They joined the NAACP in the late 1950s and attended, when they could, the weekly meetings at the New Kingdom Baptist Church in Cleveland, Mississippi. In summer 1965, the Drew Municipal Separate School District mailed FOC forms to the black and white parents of their district. They were confident that no black parent or student would actually complete and return them. As May Bertha notes, they made a serious miscalculation. They were sure that they had fixed everything around Drew so no blacks would be coming around their schools. They were so sure of that, but they didn't know about us out there on the farm. On August 12, 1965, May Bertha and Matthew Carter drove the 9 miles to Drew to drop off the FOC forms. They did not talk much on the ride there. Both knew the enormity of what they were about to do. They handed their forms to the Drew High School principal, C.M. Reed, who took them and said not a word. May Bertha and Matthew turned around and left. The next morning, Mr. Thornton, the foreman of the Pemble plantation, paid the Carters a visit at their home, in which he told them it would be best if they withdrew their FOC forms. He chided, "Your children will get a better education at the black school. The children won't have any friends at the white school. The other blacks aren't going to have anything to do with you." As Thornton hummed through a list of reasons why the Carters should reconsider their decision, May Bertha walked into their house, retrieved a record player and an LP record, and returned to her porch. She began blaring the January 11th, 1963 speech President Kennedy had delivered about the importance of the Civil Rights Act. Thornton told Matthew he would slip away to the barn while he talked some sense into May Bertha. May Bertha promptly told her husband, "You go out there to the barn and you tell Mr. Thornton that I am a grown woman. I birthed those children and bore the pain. He cannot tell me what to do about my children, like withdrawing my children out. And I'd be a fool to try and tell him where to send his kids." Matthew informed Thornton that they had decided to keep their children in the white school. Several nights later, their sharecropper's cabin was peppered with gunshot. Fortunately, no one was hurt. Later, their family garden and animal pens were destroyed, their cows and pigs lost, and their credit was discontinued at the commissary, but the Carters refused to back down. When September 3rd, 1965 arrived, Ruth, Larry, Gloria, Stanley, Pearl, Beverly, and Deborah Carter were on the school bus ready to be the first black children to attend Drew High School and A.W. Gems Elementary School. Accompanying the bus were 4 local deputies charged with getting the children safely inside the school. They did not, however, protect them from the angry whites lining the street shouting, "Go back to your own schools." They also did not protect them from the daily abuses suffered on the bus, in the school classrooms and hallways. For 4 years, the Carter children were the lone black students attending formerly all-white schools in Drew. May Bertha recounts that she and Matthew did a lot of praying and counseling for their children. Every afternoon, when they stepped off the bus, safely back at home, May Bertha greeted them and then listened as their children vented, cried, and ranted about their day. Deborah explains one of the primary messages her mother tried to convey to them. "If Mama heard me say I hate white people, I just can't stand them," she always answered, "Don't you ever say that. Don't you ever say that you hate white people or anyone. It's not right." The other thing she wouldn't let us say was that we wished we had never been born. Although May Bertha and Matthew Carter were tangentially involved in local civil rights activities, they received little support from other blacks in their community when they decided to desegregate schools through FOC, and no other black parents in Drew signed the FOC forms. They acted alone, albeit with significant help from outside civil rights organizations such as the American Friends Service Committee, Operation Freedom, and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. However, in many communities, local civil rights leaders desegregate the schools. Local civil rights leaders work together to strategically choose several students, usually their own, to desegregate the schools as a group, so no one student or family would have to bear the burden alone. Such was the case with Aline and John Adams. John was the president of the first chapter of the Rankin County NAACP. Both he and Aline were actively involved in voter registration efforts in Rankin County in the early 1960s. They housed white Northerners involved in early civil rights efforts in Jackson and the surrounding area, and they participated in the 1964 March in Selma. In 1965, John was fired from his job with the Rankin County School District because he participated in a boycott of local white restaurants. The Adams helped their first head start in Rankin County, and Aline was one of its first teachers. Aline, along with 4 of her 5 children, participated in a 20-mile 2-day protest march from the Beat County to the Brandon Courthouse in May 1965. In the early years of their activism, John attended community organizing meetings in the small town of Pisgah. At first, Aline stayed at home with the children while John was on the front lines, but as Aline explains, she too wanted to be actively involved in the movement. Usually it was the men that were going to the meetings at first, but every time they would go to the meeting and would get a ticket. Either your headlights or your tail light, or for whatever reason, you would be stopped. And I would be sitting at home with 5 kids, and I thought I needed to be with them at home. But finally we decided, we loaded them in the car and took them with us. So the kids were sitting in the back of the truck doing their homework. And we'd been in front of the church carrying on other business and what have you. And that way, I didn't have to sit at home and worry if John got a ticket. Plus, I was longing for freedom too. I always knew there was something wrong, that there was something better that the Lord had in store for us other than going through the kinds of things that we're having to go through. It wasn't that we were brave, but there comes a time when there's nothing to fear except fear itself. So you make up your mind. I guess that is what we have to do. As leaders of the local government, the Adamses, along with the four other families, agreed to test the FOC option in Rankin County. It was an emotional decision for the parents who knew their children would, more than likely, be subjected to harassment, humiliation, and perhaps violence. It was a terrible decision to have to make, Aline said. And I truly think in some cases we put them through a lot in order to get where we had to go. But somebody had to do it. It was painful, but once you bit it off, you got to chew it every day. Once the decision was made, John and Aline spent most of their time worrying about their children. They prayed a lot and hoped for the goodness of white teachers, bus drivers, students, and principals to treat their children fairly. It did not always go well, such as the time when their daughter Linda was kicked off the school bus in the middle of nowhere. Aline explains what happened. We had a bus driver once, and he wasn't a real bad person, but he assigned certain seats for the children. You get in the seat and you couldn't move. Well, for some reason, Linda moved or did something, and to this day I'm not really sure what happened, but he put her off on that road on the other side of 471 because she got up or something. And there probably was a rule that she shouldn't get up, but he had no business to put her off the bus and leave her standing beside the road. So when he came by the next day, I was ready for him. He got off the bus and talked to me, and somehow he figured that to make her understand the rule, he had to do that. But my argument was that I wanted her to obey the rules on the bus, but I don't want you putting her off by herself, leaving her. She was still pretty young at the time, and she would not be able to protect herself, so he apologized, but anyhow, I was very angry, so you had to watch out with the schools. It was a fine line for black parents who made the decision to send their children to school environments that they knew would be potentially dangerous. Do you let them fend for themselves and fight their own battles, or do you step in to fight for them? Aline and John did both. One day, while checking her youngest son's schoolwork, she came across a paper on which he had written, I hate Mrs. King, I hate Mrs. King. Aline knew Tony was a good natured child, so he could not understand why he would write such strong words about his teacher. Aline decided to pay Mrs. King a visit. I was always of the opinion that you listen to the teacher, you listen to the child, and you try to come up with what is the problem. So I went to see Mrs. King, and I didn't ever say anything else to him about any more about hating Mrs. King. You had to be kind of a mediator between hate and love and the things. We'd been taught all our lives. You don't hate her, but she was just old and it was time for her to go home. She didn't want to accept black children coming to schools. She didn't want to teach them. I didn't tell her what he wrote, that he hated her, but she chilled my bones. Their son Kenneth, who attended Brandon High, had a particularly tough time, recounts Aline. Kenneth caught the devil going to Brandon High School. He was spit on, excluded, and treated unfairly by many white teachers and students. Aline explains why Kenneth's experiences were much worse than her other children. It's always been worse for black boys than it is for black girls. They let the girls go through pretty well, but boys, they always have a tendency to say they're big, they're black, and they have a fear of them. Even when you teach them not to be outspoken and do whatever in order to get along, it seems they're always seen as a problem. Aline readily admits that her children were often resentful of their parents' activities, and sometimes they felt they were sacrificial lambs in their parents' fight for civil rights. But John and Aline were relentless. This was a battle for the future, a battle for our rights. The Adamses were part of a collective movement in their communities to test the legitimacy of FOC, and while they and their children suffered financially, socially, and emotionally for the decision, they were not the lone wolves in the fight for desegregation. However, many black parents throughout the state carried that torch alone. Ola and Isom Crockett lived in Laurel in Jones County. They had been closely following the unfolding drama surrounding school desegregation in the mid-1960s. It was through the newspaper and the nightly news they first discovered the FOC option, and as a couple, they decided they were going to use it to send their children to the white school. Ola had broken the color barrier by being one of the only two black students enrolled in a nursing program at Jones County Community College, but challenging the segregated school system of her hometown was even riskier for the Crockett's because Isom was a teacher in the school district. In Mississippi, a black teacher being affiliated with the NAACP or any other form of subversive civil rights activities often led to being fired without cause. Ola recounted an incident that occurred earlier when they lived in Canton and were pulled over by the police. We lived in Canton briefly and was questioned by the police if we belonged to any of the organizations like the he couldn't say it plain like the N double. My husband finishes off for him the NAACP. Well, it really wasn't any of his business, but that's what we ran into. Despite the risk, the Crockett's were determined that their children were going to attend the white school. Ola first visited the principal of one of the white schools to discuss her intentions to file FOC papers on behalf of her children. The principal informed Ola, "I can't be responsible for your children." News about Ola's visit spread quickly in their small hometown. They were targeted as troublemakers and soon became victims of violence, Ola explained. With me entering the nursing program and taking the children over there, somebody along the way did not like it. We went to a basketball game one night, and when we returned, there were no lights at my house. We came in. My husband says, "Somebody has firebombed our house." Why? Why would you do that? As the year progressed, we had night riders that decided they were going to shoot us off the hill. Then our insurance wasn't canceled. They thought we were too much of a risk. Despite threats and violence, Ola and Isom were not dissuaded. Their children would attend the white school under FOC. Ola arranged another meeting to discuss their plans, this time with the superintendent. The meeting went much better than the first. The superintendent knew he had no legal rationale for preventing the Crockett's from filing FOC forms, but he tried to negotiate for more time. Ola describes their meeting, so I took all 5 of my children and went down to the superintendent's office. I told them, "Sit on this bench and don't move." And I went in, and I was yakking back and forth, and I told him, "My children are going to school out there," he says. "Well, don't take them back until a certain time." "Okay, but I'll take them back, and when I do, there better be some books there for them." Ola tried to prepare her children for the ill treatment she knew they would face. She told them, "It's 900 kids over at Northeast. It's 3 of you. That means 300 to each one of you. And they're going to get you." For 1 year, the Crockett children were the only black children attending white schools in Jones County. Ola also had determined when she needed to assert herself into her children's education and when she needed to back off and let them resolve their own issues. One day, a white parent handed out birthday invitations to all the children in her son's elementary school class. When Ola called the parent to ask for directions to her house, the mother told her, "Well, I was hoping you weren't going to bring your child." Ola responded that her son had received an invitation and they were most certainly planning on attending. The mother replied, "Well, your son is not really welcomed." The next school day, Ola marched into the school office and demanded a meeting with the principal where she told him, "Don't permit parents to come in and invite a class to something when you know there are black children in there and they aren't welcome." Ola's children were able to negotiate their all-white schools and find some success. Their oldest, Dale, was the first black drum major at his high school and was relatively well accepted by his peers. However, the Crockett's always kept a close eye on their children to ensure they were safe and treated fairly. When Dale rode the band bus to out-of-town events, Ola and Isom were right behind the bus, trailing them in their own car. Ola is quick to say that she did not send her children to the white school because she thought white teachers were superior to black teachers in segregated schools. Rather, she sent them to white schools because the black schools were under-resourced and opportunities, such as traveling to band competitions, were not available to black students in segregated schools. Like most black parents making difficult decisions during school desegregation, the Crockett's simply wanted their children to have access to the same resources as white students, so they too could develop their talents and fulfill their dreams, Ola explains. Those white teachers weren't any better than the black teachers in my estimation. They just had all the materials and everything that they needed for the children in that school. We wanted a piece of the pie, and we were determined to get a piece of the pie. So I've always said being in a white school does not give you any more mental capacity. Doesn't make you smarter, because over here at Mount Olive, a segregated black school, that little school where they had to buy a microscope with money from cotton picking, they produced teachers, orthopedic surgeons, and writers. So, like I always contend, going to a white school does not give you more sense. It just gives you more equipment to work with. It gives you access to more, and we took advantage of it. Ola and Isom Crockett were not civil rights activists in the traditional sense, yet they represent an important group of black parents who were part of the school desegregation story by acting individually with no outside support to wage their own personal battle for the rights of their children to have the best education possible. As Ola notes, 1 year all 7 of us were in school, and we were all fighting different demons. As a family, they decided what did not kill them would make them stronger. While I was in nursing school, after all the insurances were canceled, my instructor called me and she says, "Why don't you just give up? I told her, no, I'm not giving up anything. And this was mid-year. I put those many months in. I'm not going to give up the rest of it. But you see how they paint this? If somebody does this to you, then run. I'm not going to run. And they, her husband and children, didn't either. And it did not affect my grades. It did not affect my husband's grades. It did not affect my children's grades. Like the Crockett's, the Adamses, and the Carters, Gilbert and Natalie Mason fought a long drawn out battle with their school system in Biloxi to obtain the right for their son to attend a white school that had all the resources they knew he deserved. In hindsight, Gilbert believes the fight was well worth every bruise and personal affront he endured because Gilbert Jr. attained an education that opened doors that would have otherwise been closed. Gilbert wrote, in spite of the vicissitudes of those early years, I think that the parents concluded that desegregation was worth the sacrifice made. I know that Gilbert Jr., for example, got access to the best science labs and the best advanced math courses available in the Biloxi schools. He excelled and went on to become a medical doctor himself. We proved that desegregation could be made to work peacefully. Our children did not have to give up their black identity to do this. Gilbert Jr. stayed very involved with his church, the NAACP youth branch, and with his neighborhood Boy Scouts troop, because our child got the best high school education available and because he learned to cultivate friendships among every race of people. I considered the school desegregation was a success. Other parents and students were not as profuse as Dr. Mason in extolling the benefits of school desegregation. However, most agreed that long-term benefits outweighed the cost, but for the students living freedom of choice in those years, there were certainly costs. A lonely existence attending schools under freedom of choice. Gloria Carter Dickerson was one of the 7 Carter children who desegregated the Drew City school system under FOC in 1965. When the FOC papers arrived in the mailbox at their home, Gloria and her siblings ripped open the letters and excitedly called their mother, who was in St. Louis, vising her mother. I think that was supposed to be visiting. Mama, we got some letter in the mail today, and when you get home, we want you to sign these papers so we can go over to the white school. When Mrs. Ricardo returned home, she asked her 7 school-age children, are you sure you want to do this? It's not going to be easy. They are not going to want you there. All 7 responded, we want to go, Mama. They began their venture into desegregated schools as innocent children excited about riding shiny buses, going to school year-round, and learning from brand new textbooks. All facts their mother had relayed to them about the benefits of attending a white school. On the first day of school, they woke up early, donned their best clothing, and waited eagerly for the bus to arrive. They were the first to be picked up, and all 7 children sat in the front 3 rows of the bus. However, as the white children began boarding the bus, the abuse and harassment they would endure for years quickly began. The white children jumped to the side as they passed their row, exaggerating their attempts to avoid physically touching them. By the 2nd or 3rd day, the abuse got physical and nastier, Gloria recalls. On the bus, the kids were just out of control. They started throwing all kinds of stuff, paper, chalk, and they called us all these names and talked about how much we stinked and said things like, don't get close to that. We were terrified and uncomfortable, and all we wanted to do was get off this bus because we did not fight back. We did not do any fighting because we were in the nonviolence of Dr. King. We didn't say anything back to anyone. Every afternoon, they related to their mother their treatment on the bus. You can't blame the children, May Bertha told them. That is what they are being taught, and they do not know any better. A few days later, the bus driver told the children, y'all need to go to the back of the bus where you belong. The Carter children dutifully obeyed, but when they told their mother that had transpired on the bus, May Bertha was not so sanguine. She promptly made a few calls and resolved the situation. The children no longer were sent to the back of the bus. Once off the bus and in the classroom, the Carter's children's experiences varied, depending largely on the white teacher in charge of the class. Pearl, Gloria's younger sister, who was in elementary school, had a particularly horrible experience with her teacher. None of the children wanted to sit by Pearl, so the teacher devised a plan in which the children rotated sitting in the desks next to her. Teacher told the students, it's your turn to sit by today. When the students objected, she directed them, push your chair as far back as you can to get away from her. Gloria's experiences were a bit better. Most of her teachers made sure that she was not visibly harassed, but it was a very lonely existence. No white students tried to befriend her or go out of their way to make her existence any easier. Gloria responded by losing herself in her books. She explained, I did a lot of studying and a lot of listening to the teacher. When we had library period, I would put my head in a book and not look up and just study and study and study. I would block everything out and just focus. And I sure learned to focus and always try to block them out. The children painfully learned how to navigate school being as invisible as they could. They determined what places to avoid, the cafeteria being the primary one. On most days, hot, cold, or rainy, they met on the front steps during lunchtime. They tried to maneuver through the halls during class periods, making as little contact with whites as possible, and unstructured school activities like pep rallies were just torturous. Unfortunately, their school lives did not get any better during the 4 years. They were the sole blacks attending the white schools. The 1969 to 70 school year was probably the worst. By then, Alexander v. Holmes was making its way through the courts, and the whites in Carter's hometown knew that soon as critical mass of other black children would inevitably be attending white schools. According to Gloria, that year was dreadful. In 1969, the whites heard that they were going to integrate the school, and the kids were so ugly to us. They were like, my daddy's really upset. He's so mad because them are going to come over to our school. It's going to be so hard on our parents because our parents don't have enough money for tuition to the private schools because we have to get out of here before them get here. I am listening to every word they're saying because they are saying it so I could hear it. And things like, you know how lazy and stinky and dumb and stinky and we don't want to be around, no. In 1970, when the rest of the black students joined Gloria at Drew High School, she was relieved more than anything else. After 4 years of enduring isolation and exclusion and hearing daily how inferior blacks were and how integration would ruin the schools, Gloria had grown weary of being the only black in her classes. She spent her senior year at Drew High School back in a largely segregated black school because a majority of whites left to attend the newly opened Sunflower Academy. When she integrated the schools as a 12-year-old, Gloria did not realize that she and her sisters and brothers were on the vanguard of the school desegregation movement. She also did not realize how dangerous the situation was and how fervently her parents prayed for their safety every time they left for school. What she did know, and it was the reason why with grit and determination they continued, was they were getting the education their parents knew was imperative for them to move ahead in life. Her mother often reminded them, you go to that school, and you listen to every word that teacher has to say, because she is teaching their kids, and they want their kids to learn. So you learn while they are learning. So no one can say you are not educated, because you are getting the same education as those white kids. No one can tell you that you are not qualified because of your education. If someone tells you that you are not qualified, you tell them, I went to school with you, so what do you mean I'm not qualified? Gloria graduated from Drew High School in 1971. She attended the University of Mississippi, where she graduated with a degree in accounting and later earned her CPA license. She worked in Jackson for Job Corps and then with the Kellogg Foundation, first in Michigan and then in Mississippi. When she retired from Kellogg, she returned to Drew and started her own nonprofit organization called We Together Creating Change. Clarence Hall, who lived in Glen Allen in Issaquah County, joined the Army in 1941 and fought in Europe for 3 years. Like many civil rights activists, Clarence's lifelong commitment to equality began in the military when he fought for his country, discovered that blacks in other parts of the country had far more rights than he, and then returned to the United States, no longer willing to accept his second-class citizenship. He explains, I don't regret the time I spent in the service because the time I spent in the service really enlightened me that people should be treated like a human being. And I knew that God didn't happen in Mississippi. I knew that didn't happen in Mississippi. I returned from World War II a changed man. God was preparing me to come back to help change Mississippi. I returned home from World War II. Before becoming active in school desegregation efforts in his hometown, Hall was a leader in the voter registration movement. He vividly recalls going to the courthouse to pay his $2 poll tax and being accosted by several whites who demanded, ain't you doing all right? City leaders made promises to him to try to deter him from registering. They said they would replace the dirt road leading to his house with a gravel road, but he stood firm, saying that he sacrificed his life for this country and he deserved the same rights as any citizen in any state. When he tried to register to vote, he was given a literacy test. He was asked to define eminent domain. He knew the answer, but the clerk interpreting his answer said he did not pass the test. He was denied the right to vote. In fact, he did not get the right to vote until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed. According to Hall, whites were afraid of the enfranchisement of blacks because they numerically outnumbered whites in Issaquah County, and they didn't want the blacks to be in power in positions of supervisor or sheriff. In one night alone, 27 crosses were burned in his community, one at his front door. His daughter Anne recalls waking up and seeing the fiery cross blazing on her lawn. She was only a first grader, and at first she was terrified. However, her fear subsided when she conjured up the image of her father. He was a giant to me. I had no fear of the Ku Klux Klan or what racist people were trying to do because I felt my dad can conquer all. Indeed, when it came to protecting Anne and his family, Clarence advocated a different approach than that of Dr. King. I'm not nonviolent. I prepared for 5 years in the service. If you touch her, Anne, you will hear from me. If you do anything to her, I will protect her. In 1965, Clarence led the efforts in Issaquah County to desegregate the schools using FOC. Clarence enrolled Anne at Riverside Elementary, an all-white school. Anne remembers well the solitude of her first grade, being one of only a few blacks in her grade. I suffered in silence. I don't think my parents really knew some of the things that I went through. The day after the cross was burned in her yard, she was sitting in her classroom when the principal's voice boomed over the intercom. "Anne Hall, please come to my office." Anne was petrified. She did not even know where the principal's office was located. Her teacher pointed her in the direction, and off she set. Me going down the hall, I had to go past other classroom. The second grade classroom, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, in order to get to the office. The white children, because there were no black children except for the second grade, they were looking at me as I'm walking down the hall. I remember the old teacher chairs sitting by the window at the entrance of the office, so when I walked into the office, the secretary told me to have a seat in the chair, and I can remember being cold in the office, temperature-wise. I had to wait until the principal called me into the office. And when he called me into the office, he asked me, "Did anything happen at your house last night?" I told him, "Yes." He said, "What happened at your house last night?" I told him the Ku Klux Klan burned the cross at the front yard. He asked me, "Were you scared?" I said, "No, I wasn't scared, and I'm still coming to school here." Then he dismissed me and told me to go back to my classroom. I went back to my classroom, but thinking back on that for years and years, why and who would subject a little child to an interrogation like that? The few black children in her first grade classroom were segregated in one row on one side of the room. They were prohibited from interacting with the white children. At recess, the children were segregated on the playground. One week, the white children played on the other side with the merry-go-round, and the black children congregated in the area with the swing sets. The next week, they switched areas. One morning, a little white girl called Anne over to her desk to show her something. Anne was excited about the invitation. When the teacher spied her at the white student's desk, she grabbed the ruler and spanked her on the leg, ordered her back to her own desk. Anne was humiliated. She had always been a good student, a good girl, and someone who respected her teachers. She had no understanding why she would be physically punished simply because she crossed the color barrier established in the room to prevent black and white students from talking or playing with each other. As Anne notes, we were clearly segregated within the integration. In second grade, Anne returned to Glen Allen, which was an all-black school that year because all the white students under FOC enrolled at Riverside Elementary. Anne describes her new school situation. "It was like a totally different world. It was a culture shock because I had not been in an all-black setting, and it was different. I existed, but it was different." During her 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade years, Anne attended Riverside Elementary under FOC, where she was the only black student in her classroom. Most of the time, she was by herself. Occasionally, a few white girls made overtures to her and asked her to play dolls with them, but these white girls were soon targeted as lovers, and they quit playing with Anne. In 1970, when Anne was in 5th grade, wholesale desegregation took place in the Western Line School District. After being the minority for most of her school career, suddenly she was thrust into a largely segregated setting with black students. According to Anne, her years of being isolated from her black peers rendered her an outsider within her new school setting. I went back to Glen Allen because it was the neighborhood school. Most of the white children from that area decided to go to private school, so I was in a majority black situation. I got a chance to see from the flip side because we had 1 or 2 white students that were there. We would go to the bathroom, and the black girls in the bathroom would treat the white girls real bad. They would pull their hair, throw tissue at them, and the girls, they were afraid to say anything. When they go back to the classroom, they'd be afraid to tell the teachers because they don't know what's going to happen to them. I didn't like it, but there's nothing that I could do about it. Every time I would speak up about it, the black girls would turn on me and they started calling me names. You think you're a little white girl? They even started pulling my hair because I had really long hair, and they would pull my hair. And they would treat me mean. I was isolated again. I was isolated within my own race. Oh, she thinks she's more than anybody else. She thinks she's white. She talks white. I heard that throughout my 5th grade to 12th grade. For 7 years until she graduated, Anne endured a different type of racial intimidation, this time from girls of her own race. Anne eventually became a teacher, then a principal, and always an advocate for children. Anne believes the long-term benefits of school desegregation outweigh the cost, even if she herself endured a rather lonely existence throughout her school years. Her own views about race, education, and the possibilities of change took root in these formative years. According to Anne, attitudinal changes are imperative for societal changes, and such changes are initiated first through exposure to people of other races. If you've not been taught better, then that's all you know. I've had a lot of white friends, associates, that have had certain prejudices that are embedded in them, and while talking to them and getting them to understand both sides, then you could see the wheels turn, and they've changed their point of view. There are some people, I believe, in the society that no matter what type of education they get or exposure they receive, they'll always be the same. But then there are others who begin to get a deeper understanding and they let go of all the hatred for no reason. Why would I hate you, someone who I don't really know? Just because of the color of your skin? Once you learn the character of the person and get to understand that person, you connect to that person on that level. You got to have bad sometimes in order to get the good. Because if all those things had not happened back in the past, we wouldn't be where we are today. I'm not saying that the world is perfect today, and I realize that the world will never be perfect, but as years go by, it gets better, and you see the progression. And one of the provisions of the FOC plan was the 9th through 12th grade students could complete their own FOC form, as long as their parent approved their choice. However, sometimes students were not fully aware of the repercussions of completing these forms. Such was the case with Robert Jackson, now a state senator representing the 11th Congressional District of Mississippi. Robert was born in 1955, his parents were sharecroppers on a plantation, and he attended segregated schools in Quitman County for most of his life. In 9th grade, he and his fellow students were given what he thought was a survey, asking them, if required, if they would be willing to attend the white school. Jackson wrote on the survey yes for the simple reason, I did what people told me to do, and I can't say no to an adult. He was soon sent to Marks High School. He recalls that meeting. The next day, I was snatched from my school and taken across the track to the white school, and I just remember going with my parents over there. Such a shock. Sitting in the principal's office there. Principal was R.T. Warden, who later became superintendent of Quitman County Schools. Mr. Warden was kind of tall and kind of a big, protruding kind of belly. And he had thick glasses, and you could see his eyeballs through his glasses. It was the scariest thing for me, sitting in his office. And then talking to my parents, telling them that I had been brought over there here to attend classes. So it was kind of disruptive for me to go from one community, one culture to another. Several other black students were sent to the white school as part of Quitman County's limited efforts at desegregation. Robert notes that as white peers, he had no idea that the black students were forced to go, as opposed to being our choice to go. Being one of a few black students at the white high school was a challenge for Robert. In fact, today he recalls little of that first day. I really tried to block it out. Everything was a challenge. Robert concedes it was not a welcoming environment. However, he notes that it prepared him to function in predominantly white institutions like the University of Southern Mississippi, where he attended college, and the Mississippi Senate, where he has served since 2004. Like many blacks interviewed for this study, Senator Jackson is ambivalent about school desegregation, recognizing its importance in breaking the segregationist hold onto the South, but saddened about the loss of black community around their school. He laments, I remember so many aspects of growing up black that we lost when we went through integration. Like you get some old albums, you see High Y, Tri High Y, and those groups that were formed at black high schools at the time, but are no longer in existence. We thought they meant it. The fallacy of freedom of choice. When May Bertha and Matthew Carter drove to Drew High School in August 1965 to deliver FOC forms to the school officials, they believed the school board was acting in good faith to abide by the Civil Rights Act. As Matthew noted, we thought they meant it. The Carters believed that they had the law and the courts on their side to protect them. They, along with many black parents, soon discovered the fallacies inherent in freedom of choice. In 1967, May Bertha Carter filed a lawsuit against the Drew School District on behalf of her children. The lawsuit detailed the many ways the school system, despite receiving federal funds, continued to maintain a racially segregated and discriminatory system that placed a cruel and intolerable burden on black persons and pupils. And that ends chapter 2 of Just Trying to Have School.